Well, hello and welcome everyone. My name is Celeste Harrison, and I'm so happy to see you all joining us today. Here at National Geographic, we believe in the power of exploration, wonder, and storytelling to change our world for the better. And this Explorer Classroom YouTube show connects students from all around the world with our National Geographic Explorers for short lessons and plenty of time for all of your questions. Today, our featured explorer is Carter Clinton. Carter is a genetic anthropologist from Brooklyn, New York. I bet you folks have heard about DNA, right? It's our genetic material, it's the building block of life. Well, Carter uses that DNA to research the lives of freed and enslaved Africans who are buried in the New York African burial ground. By taking soil samples from that burial ground and using genetic sequencing, he can detect the causes of death of enslaved Africans and other cool details, including widespread illnesses from the distant past. By looking at and studying super tiny clues left behind like bacteria and DNA, Carter hopes to shed new light on slavery in New York City. Carter's work also has really cool health implications for the living, especially for minority populations experiencing health disparities. We're going to hear all about that today. It's going to be great. But before we get to the lesson, I do want to welcome all of our friends registered to join us today from all around the world. So wherever you may be, give us a cheer when you hear your state or your country or your school or your class. Today, our students are representing Arizona, Arkansas, California, Canada, Colorado, Delaware, Florida, Hawaii, Ireland, Louisiana, Massachusetts, Malaysia, Michigan, North Carolina, New Jersey, New York, Ohio, Oregon, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Saudi Arabia, Texas, Virginia, and West Virginia. My shout outs for this afternoon, we've got Abby and Adam, Cohite Elementary Education. We've got the Culinary Student High School, Dr. Amira Mobin's class, Flex Academy, DeKalb County Schools, Gloucester Elementary, Guilford Prep, Anulia, Maple Avenue School, Miss Jones, Mrs. Baker, Mrs. Butler, and Black's classes, Mrs. Carney's class, Mrs. Porter, Mrs. Reeves, Mrs. Willett's Life Science, Miss Morrissey's 6th grade, Miss Swick's class, Miss Lloyd's 8th grade, Pine Eagle Charter, Pleasant Valley, Plumtree Park, Podger School District, PPS Chemistry, PSD Virtual, Bramblewood Middle School, Sherwood Middle School, Thomas Edison Charter, the Wheeler School, William F. Holleran School 22, Williamsburg Middle School, and Arlington Public Schools. With that out of the way, we're so happy to see you all. It's time to turn it over to Carter to kick us off today's lesson about digging up DNA.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Celeste. I appreciate that. Let me go ahead and start sharing my screen. Okay, cool. So again, we're talking about digging up DNA today, and I'll be sharing with you my dissertation research. So it gets me really excited. I hope that it gets you guys just as excited, and I hope you learned something new today. So we're gonna kind of start on a storyline. So a long, long time ago, not as far back as, say, the dinosaurs, for instance, but about 400 years ago. So this was the time that colonists came to what we now know today as America. And as you can tell, back in those days, from the pictures, they dressed a little bit different. Their hats were a little bit different. The way we traveled, right, was a little bit different. And even the way we harvested crops and raised our food sources were a little bit, or even sometimes a lot different. All right. So let's narrow it down and let's kind of talk about what exactly was going on. Why did those colonists come here? So a lot of some of the facts that we know about the past are very well known. Other facts we don't know so much about. So we kind of want to ask these questions and uncover what was going on at the time. Today, and for the purpose of my research, we'll focus on slavery and the very thing that helped America rise to the global powerhouse that it is today. So, did you know in 1860, enslaved Africans as property were worth more than all the banks, factories, and railroads in the country all put together? Well, yeah, it's true. However, we know these facts on a greater scale, but we don't know what happened for the day to day lives of these individuals. So, what I'm doing, I narrow this down to an even smaller concentration. I wanted to know what was going on in New York City. So, when you think about New York, you think about skyscrapers, maybe shopping, the bright lights, all of the places that you may want to visit or look so glamorous, right? Well, it didn't always look like that. At one point, New York had um, hills, mountainous areas, lush vegetation, and trees. And as you can see in this left hand picture, there was even a major water source in lower Manhattan called the Collect Pond. Now, these features existed around the same time as slavery. Now, we don't know much about the existence of slavery, the lives of slaves or enslaved Africans in the North, let alone New York City. We think of it as a very progressive town, a very progressive city, right? We know a lot about what was going on as far as slavery was concerned in the South. So I'm going to talk about some of those differences. Well, in the North, enslaved Africans had more rights or specific rights that they may not have had in the South. So as we can see on the left-hand side, they did something called jump in the broom, or they were able to get married, legally married. They were also able to read, to write. They were able to move about the island of Manhattan more freely than on the plantations of the South. Now, why are we even talking about New York? Here's one fact you may not have known. New York City, or the New Amsterdam colony then, held more enslaved Africans than any other colony, second only to the major slave trading port of Charleston, South Carolina. Yes, that's true. However, the way that they lived were a little bit different. As I mentioned, we had plantation versus non plantation style living. So in New York, the slave masters, they had smaller quarters. And so the enslaved Africans, they were free to leave, um, live other places, carry out their rituals in other places. However, in places like South Carolina, Louisiana, Georgia, on larger plantations, this is where slaves lived. This is where they worked. This is where they spent majority of their time. It was almost like their prison, right? And even after their death, their bodies still remain there. One major difference was in New York, enslaved Africans, fortunately, on some scale, were able to retain their West African cultural practices. So they were able to have these celebrations mainly during the time of burials. So during the day, they worked, they experienced forced labor, hard labor, but at night, they were able to congregate, they were able to bury their loved ones and do so in a way that was familiar to them. Now, around the year 1800, slave owners they wanted this land that ens- free and enslaved Africans used to bury their loved ones. This land or this burial burial site was known as the Negroes' burial ground. Today, we know it as the New York African Burial Ground. So that means around the year 1800, they took this land back, they covered it up, and we really just forgot about it. But what is it? It is the oldest and largest burial site of free and enslaved Africans ever discovered in the country. Its earliest use dates back to the early 1600s, and the end of its use dates around 1797. It is now a national landmark and a national monument. You can, if you are ever in New York or visit Manhattan, um, I encourage you to go visit. They have a visitor center and an outside memorial that I think that you'll love and learn more about. So one of the reasons this is also so important is if enslaved Africans didn't live on a plantation in New York, this is a cemetery where almost all of the enslaved Africans on this island were buried. There's an estimated 15,000 bodies still buried there, as opposed to in the South with plantation living, where the bodies of enslaved Africans are kind of scattered all over. Now, let's fast forward. 1990, the federal government, they go to erect this very tall building, so they had to dig much deeper than all of the other buildings around. When they started construction, all of these skeletons started to be uncovered. They then stumbled across this 400-year-old Negroes burial ground, or as we know it today, the New York African Burial Ground. In 1991, the remains were brought to Howard University, and researchers explored these remains to learn anything they could. They asked questions like, how tall were these individuals from the skeletal measurements? How many males? How many females? What kind of forced labor did they perform? Also, they looked at the artifacts that were buried with each of these individuals. So now, fast forward again, 2017, I'm here and I'm still very curious about these individuals and this project. So I have questions of my own. Today, unfortunately, the bones have been reburied back at the site where the monument is in a ceremony out of respect. So what I'm doing is using the soil that was found in and around the remains to answer my questions. So how does this happen? Well, let's focus on this video really quickly. We have this person here, all the things that are inside of them, the bacteria, and all of the bacteria that are on each of our bodies. They live with us, they carry out these commensal relationships, but even after we die, they're still there. And 400 years later, they're still able to be seen. So I wanted to know from this information or from this resource, what were the lifestyles of these individuals like? Did they suffer from any infectious diseases? And what were they? What did they eat? And also, what was their quality of life? The first thing we set out to do, I took a few of my undergraduate researchers, a few of my undergraduate students, we went out to New York and we said, okay, how can we see the difference between our New York African burial ground burials, and what we needed was a control sample. So we collected soil samples from in the open parts or whatever green space we could find in New York City. We then went from the field to the lab and we started doing all of these DNA extractions to figure out, can we extract DNA from soil? And we also have over here on the right, a picture of all of the tools that we use, like pipettes, centrifuge machines, all of the things that you as a future researcher may also use. Now, once we had that DNA extracted, which looks like something over here in a really, really small vial, we put it into a next generation sequencer. So let me back up for a second. Let me explain what DNA is. It really is this chemical makeup that makes you you and makes me me. And by looking at it, we can see your hair color, your eye color, um, who you're related to, like your brothers and sisters or parents, and even where you may have come from or where your ancestors may have come from. So we take that extracted DNA, we put it into a next generation sequencer, which is really just a fancy name for a computer that figures out what this DNA means, or it decodes it so it turns it into something that we can actually understand. What it looks like is here on the right. It's just a bunch of DNA sequences spelled out in A's, T's, G's, and C's. And once we get that information back, then we have to go ahead and decode it again. So a sequence with A's, T's, C's, and G's may be specific to your hair color or specific to where your ancestors were from. We did this for all of our burials. We took them, we applied them, all of this information to each one of the burials, and also re superimpose that information back on where we found them in the burial ground. So it looks something like this. This is kind of a 2D rendition of the New York African burial ground if we outline the entire thing with the slide. Each of these coffin shaped outlines is going to represent each of those burials. All of the blues are male, all of the pinks are female. Some of them we couldn't really determine. Um, and what I've done here with this male burial is listed all of the things that we found or created a profile for this individual. So this was burial 235. We didn't know their name. We know they were a male. We know from the anatomical structures that they were between 25 and 35 years old. We know that this person had a leafy diet or a heavy vegetative diet. They were buried with copper buttons and clothing. So maybe perhaps this person was even a free African versus an enslaved African. And we found out that their cause of death, or we know that something that they suffered from, was pneumonia by finding this bacterial DNA in that specific burial. So again, for other burials, we found evidence of cholera, dysentery, evidence of poor food conditions like the salmonella bacteria, just telling us more and more about these individuals. We took all of that information and we entered it into an entire database to learn more about what these individuals were doing at the time, what New York looked like at the time, and even widespread pandemics or epidemics that this population experienced in the 1600s. So that's cool, and that explains, why this is important for these people who lived 400 years ago. But why is it important for people who are living today? Okay, so now what we're doing, we collect all this information, we've put it in a database, and what we want to do is make it available for doctors to make informed decisions, educated decisions, and use towards precision medicine, gene therapy, and specific treatments. So, although these enslaved Africans were very limited in what they could do 400 years ago, their efforts are still being used today to help us discover and assess new diseases or learn more about diseases that we're already familiar with. So it helps us to add to these genetic databases, which right now are lacking representation for people of color, specifically African Americans. So all of those spaces can now be filled in from the information that we've collected and generated from 400 year old DNA. This helps you and me for the times that we want to go to the doctor. Now the healthcare industry is moving into precision medicine. So you go to the doctor, you're very different from me. So you would get a medicine that is specific for you and tailored to your own DNA makeup. That way we know you don't have as many side effects and we know that medicine works for you. And now the next step that we need is more researchers like you. We need you to go out, visit your landmarks, your local parks, your national parks, uh, read as much as you can, study your history, watch as many videos as you can, and who knows, maybe you can find DNA in 1,000-year-old soil.